thank you everyone for joining the session. We're delighted to be joined by Jason Dykstra, who is joining us now. Jay has been a member of our community for a number of years, and I think you've all seen his bio. It's super impressive, a number of things he's done, and managed it all while juggling a family and various other commitments, as well as a full-time job. And the aim of the session today actually is really to take a step back and chat with Jay on a sort of a relatively small group setting and about what it means to be an EA at a personal level, and how he finds that. And so there's kind of, in a way, and I hope Jay don't mind me saying this, there's kind of no question is out of bounds here. We're going to talk through a few basic things that, a few questions that I've prepared and that Jay will hopefully be able to answer. What we have is you'll see in the schedule a link to Slido. I don't have chat enabled here, so I can't send it to you, but on the schedule, that should come up. And Slido is basically an application where you can pop in your questions there. And if you can't think of questions on your own, you can then vote on other people's questions. And essentially the questions with the more votes go up to the top. So, if there's a question that lots of people want asking, then it's more likely to get asked. So that you'll find the Slido link in the schedule that you should all have. So please do drop questions in there. What I'll probably do is, if there's any, I'll keep an eye on that there. And if there's any questions that are very relevant to what Jay's talking about at that particular moment, then I'll drop them into the conversation. But otherwise, the aim is to have 10-15 minutes at the end where we can touch on the most popular questions asked on Slido. So with that, I think it's probably good to get started. So Jay, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction? Can you tell us a bit about your faith background and how you felt God was calling you to be an effective altruist?
Sure. I just want to thank you all for being part of this and the other sessions as well. First of all, just the fact that you're here shows that you already have an interest in really just pursuing a global body of Christ mentality, and what I would say is a biblical kind of a way to look at getting out there and doing what you're supposed to do in the world. And I hope you find that fulfilling already. I am a diagnostic radiologist, been so for 12 years here in Michigan in the United States. And my examples growing up, there was no such thing as an EA movement back then, but I did have a couple crucial examples of generosity with people who just were very transparent and honest and kind of went out of their way to keep track of how much they gave. I also had a couple just role models out in the public that reportedly did some pretty radical things with giving. And for somebody like me who's kind of type A, that was a bit of a challenge. And I kind of took that on personally, which ended up serving me well. And then, coming down to the last, 5-10 years or so, when the EA movement really started going, a couple people directed me toward that in particular, allowing me to put more research and more retrospective evidence to the ideas that I had been developing and that God had been developing in me. And fortunately, I was still young enough at that time, as are most of you, to really be able to set patterns and mindsets for my wife and my life. And we developed this vision and journey that we both got very excited about in our 20s and into our 30s that made it really easy, actually, to live an EA lifestyle that most would consider to be pretty radical. And that's kind of what I want to just share today, is just how to make that transition very easy instead of it being something that feels very painful or overly sacrificial, because it's not meant to be. It's meant to be fulfilling, and God created us for that. The one other the piece of it that I would say is important is the whole time I was encouraged to really pursue just a regular time with God and getting to know Him. And I forget sometimes that that's actually the central point of all of this in Christianity, is this marriage that we have in heaven between Christ and the church. All of the things we do here, our impact, the way we help the poor, the way that we engage the world, our moral uprightness, these things are all good. But the only thing that truly persists through into eternity is this desire to be with God as God forever. And I underestimated, and still do sometimes, how much He does in the background to help us have impact when we remember to put that relationship first. So I have to say that too, because that's really the fundamental drive of Christianity, and all our desire for EA comes from that desire to be like Christ. So that's I guess where I'll stop with introductions. I think we might talk about family later, so I'll keep that for them.
Super, thanks, Jay. And I guess you sort of touched a bit on it, but like, what principles have you found sort of most helpful in sustaining the EA lifestyle sort of over the years?
Sure. I think the most important one, and perhaps the one that God would want us to remember the most, is that we are part of a global body, truly, and that we have gifts in our part of the body that we're meant to nourish, especially the most unreached and neglected parts of the whole global body. And it's so easy to think of church as a very local thing, but in reality, there is only one church, and there is only one head of that church, and that's Jesus himself. And so we have to act as if he were guiding us, and we have to act as if he were truly our head. And obviously we all strive to do that, and we all fail to do that in various ways, including myself. But I think that principle, just realizing that I'm a member of something much, much bigger than myself and much, much bigger than my local community, has been extremely important. Kind of on a more practical standpoint, it might seem obvious, but I would also say just setting an amount that you live according to and sticking to that, whatever your capacity is, wherever you're at right now, is probably the most important idea in building a successful, sustainable EA mindset. And I think back to the story about Jesus in the temple when he's asking the disciples who's more generous, the woman who gave both the coins that she had and that was it, that's all she had, or the guy that gave a bunch of gifts and kind of lavishing the temple with gifts. And the disciples that get it right and say it's the woman, not because she gave less or because the man gave more, but because she kept less. And, we can talk about how much we give, and that can be impressive and that can be a good goal. But I think it's more important to define how much we're going to keep, because it's actually an applicable standard for everyone. Everyone can determine how much they're keeping, even if they don't have gobs and gobs of money to give. And sometimes those who keep less but give less are much more sacrificial than those who keep more but give more. The Bill Gates of the world and the Oprah Winfreys of the world are very generous, but they also keep billions of dollars for themselves. And that's not a practical or realistic example for any of us. But when you define how much you keep to your capacity, when you challenge yourself for that, it can't just be something easy. That has been very helpful. And that's a standard we've used that has been great. The other thing that does is it always forces us to consider a relatively sacrificial or large chunk of our money to not be ours, to not be spendable, to not be something we can touch. And that one concept is probably the most important for us that has been helpful in building an EA lifestyle, is to always consider something that you have not touchable, not able to be spent. Now that can be used to pay off debt, that can be used to tithe, that can be used to give to EA charities. So it can be used for different things, but it's not something you can live up to. And that idea that you can't live up to your means is a mentality that will serve you your entire life. And I truly think that's one big reason why God calls us to give, and that by the concept of the tithe is a biblical one, because he wants us to get used to the fact that something always belongs to someone else and not us, even though we have it in our possession. The last thing, I guess the third principle that I would say is very important, is to always give something to an EA charity or an impactful charity, no matter where you're at in life. And for those of you who are deep in debt or have nothing to give, or you feel like that, I've been there. I went to medical school and I was up to my eyeballs in debt. I was way in the red for a very long time. So I totally understand your predicament. But even then, with the government loan money we were getting, or with the small amount I was making at restaurant work, we chose to still set our limit somewhere and devote something above and beyond that to what we knew at the time to be the most effective. We've learned since then. But that does a whole lot of things, because there's these two camps. Do you give now and not save up and build up a huge nest egg, or do you build up a huge nest egg financially and then give once you have a ton of money later on? And these two they're not so much competing, but they're definitely different mindsets. And I want to definitely promote the first one I talked about for several reasons. And I'll finish up this question with this. The first is, when you're even giving a little tiny bit now, you're developing human interest, even though you might not be developing financial interest. So you are saving lives, people are healthy, people are contributors to their society because of what you're giving now. And all of that bears fruit over the next 40 years. So even though you're not making necessarily financial interest on that, people are having kids, people are contributing to their community, people are able to give to their society instead of having to be consumers of that. And that all builds up a multiplying human interest, which is beautiful, truly beautiful. Another reason to give now is because it also multiplies your own understanding about charity. I talked to several people who are retirement age, and they have this huge nest egg, but they have no idea what to do with it. And they don't understand anything about impact. And they've become so tied to some of the lower impact causes or some of the lower impact initiatives that they've been familiar with their whole life, that it's almost impossible for them to transition their mind over to different causes or more impactful giving, because they have this kind of entrenched mindset. They want to, but it's very hard for them to. So even when they do get to that point of giving, it's very difficult for them because they haven't been educating themselves about impact and about charity that entire time. Another reason too is because you might not realize it right now, but you are actually a huge advocate to the people around you. Many of you are young adults, and so you have peers that are learning how to use their money. They're developing their career. They're figuring out themselves how to think about money and charity and impact in the world. And they need to see somebody that's their age, that's in their phase of life, that is doing that successfully. They desperately need that example. And if you're another person that's just saving up and not spending now, then it's going to be difficult for any of you to actually develop that mindset because they don't have any example to follow or to ask questions to. And that progresses into your family life. Obviously, the spouse you're going to end up with is going to be very different if they see that your life is one of constant giving and impact rather than one of saving, and hoarding in some ways. And because you're going to marry a very different person, depending on which of those paths you go down, it's going to be that much harder then to switch later on, right? And so it's extremely important to be able to find a spouse that's congruent with this kind of, constant kind of giving mindset. But that also extends to your kids as well. If your kids are growing up seeing that the only thing you spend your money and time in is your job and your spouse and your kids, guess what they're going to do when they grow up? They're only going to spend their money and time on their job, their spouse, and their kids. They need to see you, in addition to caring for them, caring for the rest of the world. And they need that example of being a global member in the body of Christ as well, so that they can be easily, amenable to be able to adopting those kind of practices. And it's amazing when kids feel like it's normal to give a lot of their money. When you set up their piggy banks so that, let's say, a third of it or a quarter of it automatically goes to somebody else, I mean, they absorb that and it becomes very normal and easy for them instead of having to backtrack later on when they become adults too. A couple more reasons real quick that's important is because it's very difficult actually to make the transition if you're not giving now, if you're not setting aside that amount of money or that bit that you can't spend. Again, I talked to a lot of older people trying to make this transition. And just think about it. For 40 years, you have spent your money in certain ways. You have properties, you have belongings. It is almost impossible to backtrack from that, even if you had always intended to, even if that was always in your brain. Because you've got a wife, you've got kids, you've got a family, you've got a social circle, you've got a neighborhood, you've got a dwelling, all of which keeps you entrenched in that and makes it extremely difficult to go back. Which is why I love talking to young adults, because if you guys make those decisions now wisely, while you're building kind of this mentality and understanding who you are as an adult, it's going to be almost a seamless transition for you once you're making more money to be able to continue doing that well. And then finally, well, not finally, but the last couple reasons. First of all, God wants you to actually be these parts of who you are. Sometimes we think of giving as just, somebody else benefiting, but we don't realize that sometimes giving is the only way that we can actually be certain parts of who we were. There's certain causes, certain people groups in the world, certain ways of serving that you can only do through money because you can't go there, because you can't use your time necessarily. You can't get a job that's going to allow you to do that. And you're robbing yourself of being these parts of who you are if you're not engaging actively in being able to give at least something. Plus, when your job isn't the best thing on earth, or when your relationships are looking difficult, or when things aren't going well in life, your money can always be doing something fulfilling and fruitful, even when other circumstances of life don't allow you to. And that gets you through things like medical school. It gets you through things like a rough first job or a difficult patch in life, because it gives you fulfillment that God had always created you for. And of course, the final reason is because simply God tells us to, right? He tells us to spend our resources. 2 Corinthians 9, 8 through 11 is a beautiful verse where he says that we need to that he enriches us in every way so that we can be generous on every occasion. He's filling us up, not so that we can save it and then give it later, but so that we can keep giving it now. And I'm a medical nerd, so I think about this in terms of the body. But if you think about an aorta coming out of your heart, the big blood vessel that feeds the rest of the body, if the aorta just accumulates all that blood that the heart's pumping into it for itself, and it's going to give it all to the body later, the body's going to starve right now, and the aorta is eventually going to explode, right? That's called an aneurysm. And so the function of the aorta is to take what the heart, or God in this analogy, is giving it, and to immediately give almost all of it away so that it can feed the body and nourish the parts that need it the most. And only then is it providing its function, not if it's kind of hoarding it up for later. And we see, of course, that in Luke 12, Jesus tells us the story of the man who's building bigger and bigger barns because he's kind of saving things up, for himself. And he said, and God says to him, "You fool, your life will be demanded to you this very night." So you don't know when, you're going to have to give an account to God. And so it's so much better, obviously, to be being filled by God so that you can generously give to others. And that doesn't have to be a high amount. It just means that you're giving something where you're keeping an adequate amount to be able to truly make an impact, whatever capacity you have. So it's a really long answer, I'm sorry, but all those concepts have been so important to us as we've developed this mindset. So I'll let Grayden talk for a minute now.
No, that's very helpful, Jay. And we've had a question come through on Slido. For those of you who joined since we started, we're using there's a link to Slido on your the conference schedule that you can click on. You can submit questions there. The very specific one: any tips for how we should set our budget for our further pledge? How do you think about it, just very practically? Where do you set the level? And I think we had a good discussion on Facebook about this recently, so it'd be really good to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, the answer has to start with, it depends on, your capacity, of course. But I think one way to do it is to focus again on how much you're keeping, not how much you're giving. So be able to set a level for yourself where this is all I'm going to spend. Or if you're in a relationship, or if you're in a family, this is all we're going to spend this year. That level depends on, of course, what your income is, what your capacity is, what your debt is. But the rest of it, all the rest of it, wherever you set that level, is meant then to pay off debt, to pay off, any interest related debt, to pay off, and obviously to give to some EA charities too. As far as an actual amount, I do think starting with a tithe is a fairly reasonable amount for many people. Some people can't do that, and that's okay. And again, that's focusing on how much you give, but you're basically determining how much you keep so that you can do something that approaches a tithe. And that's what we did during medical school. We took the government loan money that we got. We decided that we were going to give 1/10 of the post-tax income away, and it ended up being just slightly more than that. But it gave us all of the benefits I just described, even though we weren't giving a whole lot, to be able to do that. And that actually helped us more than anything else really build that whole mindset through our 20s while we were in debt, so that when I started making money as a physician, it was a super easy transition. We were able to pay our debt off much quicker because all of a sudden we had a lot more in that you can't spend this category. We kept ourselves at the same level as far as what we could spend, and we paid off our debt very, very quickly because of that, while we continued to tithe. And then when the debt was paid off, we could very easily then transition into just giving so much more. And we increased our standard of living slightly during that time. So it's not like you have to live like you're in your early 20s for the rest of your life. But at the same time, we were so used to it at that point that we didn't even feel the need to significantly increase, kind of how much we were spending. And that was the same when kids came along as well. So again, building that mindset is key to making this successful. So hopefully that helps. Okay.
And it's a tough one for you. What are the things you found most difficult about maintaining an EA lifestyle? And does having a spouse and kids and things like that make things harder?
Yeah, I think one of the most difficult things is this save to give later mentality. We talk about earning to give all the time, but really what that means for a lot of people is earning to someday give. And what happens is that you get so used to spending money on family and on other things because you still have a pretty big nest egg saved up. And that nest egg is big, but it gets smaller and smaller over time. You keep justifying expenses because it's still pretty big. You still can convince yourself you're going to give a lot away, and you end up actually giving a lot less. And a lot of people don't end up giving anything. They give it to their kids or whoever when they die. So that earning to give later mentality is a huge obstacle to this. I also think it's actually 3 big obstacles, but all in the same thing. When you have a decision point or transition in your life, when you buy a new dwelling to live in, when you move into a new neighborhood, and when you are building a new social circle. Those are three things in particular that you have to make very wise decisions about. Am I buying this house in a place that's going to cause me to have to upkeep it? I'm going to have to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. I'm going to have to keep a certain level of standard of living that's not going to let me maximize my impact. Or am I buying a place that's still good, but is going to allow me to do that? Same with your neighborhood. Are the people around me going to expect me to maintain a high standard of living? Am I going to feel that pressure to constantly live up to that? Of course, your social circle is the same way, right? And if you make decisions about who you're around, where you live, and the dwelling that you live in to maximize your impact for EA, it makes it unbelievably easier. And for us, we live in a very normal, average neighborhood. It's actually near one of the lowest income neighborhoods in all of our city. And because of that, we have a huge diversity of neighbors. We never ever feel like we have to keep up with anybody. And yet we still live very comfortably, and it's wonderful. And I love that. I don't live in a doctor neighborhood, and I love that because I actually feel like a normal human being, number one, but also it's easy to maintain our EA mindset. And that kind of answers the second question too, with spouse and kids. Obviously, if your kids are seeing kids around them that are all having the latest gadgets, that all have the latest and greatest things, that are all in the most elite kind of clubs, or engaging in some of the most elite types of activities around the community, they're going to want to do those things too, right? And so they're going to very innocently, but very persistently try to basically increase your standard of living, kind of shuffle money away from what you might spend it on an EA charity, and it's going to get shunted to those things. And it's going to be very difficult to say no to that consistently. The same is true, again, we talked about with your spouse. It is such a blessing. And my wife is just an absolute jewel because she walked this journey with me. And because we got married with the understanding that we were going to try, at least in the way we knew, to maximize kind of our impact. And when you have that, it's beautiful. When you don't, it's very difficult. But I do want to say, if you don't, if for those of you who are maybe older or married or are already in those situations where there's expectations that an EA lifestyle would be hard to meet, I think the best way to frame it to them is to say, look, God created you for something amazing. And I know that you're passionate about these specific human needs. Maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's dignity, maybe it's gender equality, upward mobility, whatever it is. I want to help you actually be that part of you as much as I can, right? So you're not asking them to give up something. You're not asking them to say, oh, we can't have this anymore. You're saying, I care about you so much that I want you to be the most of who God created you to be. And I want to take this basic need that you're passionate about, and I want to grow that into something beautiful. And here's a couple ways we might consider talking about doing that. And when a person is realizing that you're invested in them as a person, it's a lot easier for them to transition away from things that they thought that they wanted to be the person who they were created to be. And I found that to be a good way to engage people in general about EA, is to really take a base human need that they love, not necessarily the face they put on it, but the need, and say, hey, how can we actually grow that and make that beautiful by diverting that to a different population or charity that is going to make you so much more impactful with that, right?
We've got a question on the Slido, just a very practical one. How fruitful do you think it is to constantly evaluate how we're spending our time and resources, say once a month? And how would you recommend doing this?
Yes, it's interesting that you asked that, because this very next week we're going to be doing that for ourselves every April or May, and we only do it once a year. But we go through all of our expenditures, and we kind of keep an informal eye on it during the year to make sure we're not getting out of hand. But it's honestly never been a problem, because once you get used to living at a certain standard of living, you tend to spend about the same amount of money every year. And I think in the last 9 years that we've done this, only once we've accidentally gone over, and then we, gave extra money to the point where we were able to kind of get back to our goal. But we only do it once a year. We used to do it every 6 months, where we would look at our credit card statements, we would look at our checking account or whatever financial vehicles you use, and look at how much you've actually spent. And it does take a few hours to evaluate that. You have to add it all up. And you have to decide how to factor taxes into that. So we do factor all taxes except for income tax into that for ourselves. So we don't include our income tax that we had to pay in that calculation, but you do however you want. But it's not that difficult, actually, every 6 months or every year, just to go through everything, add everything up, and make sure that your expenditures and that your giving are where you wanted them to be, and that you've actually kind of not spent more than you set for a goal. And if you do, then you kind of adjust it each year if you need to. We've actually found that since it hasn't been hard for us to meet our goal, then what we do instead is actually challenge ourselves a little bit and actually make it a little more sacrificial. We've never had to go backward. We've never had to say, oh, this was impossible. Now we need to spend more on ourselves. That hasn't happened at all. And that's included when we've added kids to the mix. It's actually been pretty easy to stay at that as long as you have that mentality. So for us, as a family of four, we live in America. That's $50,000. And so that's a lot of money for some people. I totally understand that. And so your number is going to be different, and that's totally fine. But that's what we wanted to set it at. It's well below the U.S. median income, and so we wanted to kind of be living in some ways where that half of the country is living at. But it also gives us a really easy number to use, and it hasn't been a problem at all. Again, for you, with your situation, it's going to be different, and that's totally fine. The point is that you're making setting a level that you feel God would challenge you to, and living according to it, and that's amazing and awesome if you're able to do that, and you'll experience the wonder of the impact that you'll be able to have with the rest of that money.
And how do you find discussing EA with sort of other Christians who are sort of not as familiar with these concepts, either through the things you're doing to sort of actively raise awareness of these things, or just speaking to people in your church who may be aware of what you're doing? And perhaps you could share some insights as to sort of the successes and failures you've had in those scenarios.
Sure. The first thing that we've learned, and this is all, there have been a lot of failures in the learning in this. So I'm going to be completely humble and say we've made some mistakes here in this, and I'll share those with you so that maybe you don't have to make them too. But the first thing is to realize how rare it is to think from an EA mindset. We kind of are in this community and maybe are used to thinking about impact, but almost everybody else isn't, and that includes Christians in churches. For many of them, giving is, if they do it at all, is mostly exclusively to their church or to some sort of reactionary giving, like their friend tells them about a cause or they see something online. It certainly isn't a strategically planned kind of an EA mindset. And so you have to know that going in. You have to realize that their point A is usually, not always, but usually very, very different. And you kind of have to treat them like they're at the very beginning of the process and respect that, because that's where their journey is at, and you can't expect it to be somewhere else. So I think going into it again with this idea that you're wanting them to be every part of who God created them to be is so helpful in that regard, because you're not going in saying you have to care about malaria when they've literally never thought about malaria in their life before, right? Or you have to care about, parasites or animal welfare or AI when they've literally never even thought about this kind of stuff. But instead going into it saying, hey, I want to know what human need in the world. And I always say in the world, not around them, but in the world, you really want to change and be part of addressing. And sometimes they'll give you a population like the homeless, or they'll give you kind of a cause like, well, cancer has been a big part of my family's life. And then you can say, okay, well, what is it about cancer that you really want to alleviate? Do you want people to be more healthy? Do you want them to have a better quality of life? Or if it's homelessness, do you want them to have dignity? Do you want them to be able to have upward mobility? And you're taking the face of charity for them, and you're reducing it down to the root human need, which is hugely important. Because once you do that, you can say, you know what, you seem to care a lot about dignity. Can I share with you a couple of different ways that you can actually give dignity to so many more people, that have so many less parties and government programs and nonprofits that are helping them already? And it's then you can take something they do care about and actually apply it to something that is more impactful, a population that's more neglected, or something that's going to actually help more people. And you haven't sacrificed an ounce of their desire or their care. You're just helping them to move it to a different type of a target. So that's a really helpful way kind of to have that intro EA thing. I think statistics can be very helpful, but in limited doses. So the ones I found most helpful to use, and I live in America, so it may be different elsewhere, but I suspect not too different in the developed Western world, But first of all, 95% of donations in America go to Americans. And so there's a huge bias in-group bias in giving to America. I've also found helpful, if you read through Will McCaskill or Peter Singer's stuff, that it costs about $2,000 or 2,000 times as much to save a life here in America than it does in the poorest nations in the world. And when you combine those together, we're realizing that 95% of the resources are going to where it's costing 2,000 times as much, right? And there are other statistics like that, but I like to use some of those bigger ones just to help people realize the disparity that exists, because they honestly don't know that it's even there. They know in their minds that there's people in need in the world, but they don't know how biased we are toward giving to our in-groups, and they have no idea how much more they can do in other places of the world with their money. And then you can just totally focus then on their desire to make an impact and on these root human needs that they care about. And it's a beautiful thing, because suddenly you see them start waking up. Now, it doesn't happen right away. And that's the last thing I want to say, is that this is a big journey for a lot of people. So being patient is the third and most important thing here. Realize where their starting point is, help them to be more of who they were created to be according to a human need they care about, and then be patient. But don't be patient and just sit there and wait. Just keep sending them little reminders. Keep posting on Facebook about different things. Keep inviting them to a fundraiser here and there. Just a non-committal thing where you're kind of just including them, keeping it at the forefront of their mind. And after doing this for a few years, I've seen people that have been completely antagonistic to EA. Like they wouldn't even give you the time of day with it. Suddenly giving, all of a sudden, and giving monthly to various causes, like our charities on blessbig.org or other places. And they're giving to these because over time, they've kind of been learning in the background and been understanding better, and God's been working on them to be able to do that. And along with that persistence, remember that they're people too. They are not objects of an EA mission, and we can't treat them like that. So over that time, know what to be praying for them. Ask them how they're doing, and make sure that you're treating them as people, even as you're trying to help them toward EA as well. And of course, if they know that you're caring about them as a person, they're going to be far more likely to actually be listening to what they're seeing online, to what they're seeing in your encouragements. And that has actually borne a lot of fruit for us in our conversations. It's just that patience, that persistence, but that also treating them like people, which has been great. So we don't do this perfectly, you guys. Like, we're learning all the time, and so I want to say that too. So if you've got other suggestions or thoughts that have worked for you, go for it. And teach me those things, because I would love to know them as well.
Great. We do have quite a large group, so I'm going to run off Slido. They've got a number of very good questions in there.
Yeah,
I will say we probably won't get the chance to address them all, but Jay has kindly agreed that the ones that don't get asked in this session, he'll take away and he'll write up some answers, and we'll provide a link to them probably via the Facebook group and some of the conference follow-ups. But I think to start off right at the very top, which it feels like a very relevant question to what we've just been discussing. I know you care a lot about the local church. How do you balance international giving and still caring for your local community?
Right, that's a beautiful question. And I want to emphasize, even though it might not seem like it from all I've said, there are people in massive need in our local community. And these, especially during COVID, and we know this, right? People are just having all kinds of mental illness issues, loneliness issues. They don't feel fulfilled. Some of them have economic issues, and others as well. So I want to say that very in a heartfelt way. I really, truly know and care about the fact that there are local needs. We've had a very interesting journey with what you would call the local church or church institution, where as we're reading the Bible and pursuing this relationship with God, it's been very difficult to align that with the typical institutional church approach, which many of you know is extremely inefficient with money and is much more self-centered and me-focused than it is get out in the world and be a member of the local body of Christ. And I don't say that to say that local churches are just bad. They're not. But I'm saying that to say that as we've looked at our local community, as we see how many nonprofits, how many churches, how many individuals, and how many government programs are already available to the people in need here, we're not choosing to abandon these needs, but we're choosing to do two different things. Number one, we're choosing to be the very, very small number of people, the 5%, not the 95%, that are going to actually care about needs elsewhere. So we're letting the 95% keep addressing the local needs. They're not going unaddressed. It's just that they're so over-addressed, relatively speaking, that we need to be part of the 5% that's getting out and addressing needs that nobody else is addressing. So you're simply just reducing the bias against non-local needs. You're not abandoning local needs when you're choosing to operate from an EA standpoint. And that's very important to understand and explain to people. But secondly, you can also use different resources besides money to address local needs. So money, as most of us know, is a phenomenal resource to use for many international needs, for many needs that are outside of developed nations. It's extremely effective, it's freely transferable, and it's more valuable there than it is here. But you have time, you have advocacy, and you have education, all of which you can also use for those local needs. And I'm not saying you can't ever spend money on local needs either, but money simply just doesn't go as far, nearly as far locally as it does elsewhere. And so instead you might say, hey, I have a friend that's struggling with mental illness. I can throw piles of money at her and it's not going to do anything. But what I can do is I can actually engage her with my time in a very meaningful way for her, right? And I'm actually helping her with her need in a much more helpful way because I'm using the right resource. Advocacy could be another one. Many are interested in racial equality, of course, in the States at this time and elsewhere. Or maybe you're interested in just another cause in a developed nation. Well, advocacy is a wonderful thing that you can do in strategic ways to help people raise awareness for that, right? And of course, our education is maybe the biggest one. As a doctor, I obviously help a lot of patients through the reading of interpreting of studies that I do. But when I'm reading 100 chest x-rays in a day, I'm not only thinking about the, okay, but not amazing benefit I'm going to give to each of my patients. I'm thinking about how much money I'm making from those chest x-rays, where it's going, and how much impact that is having. And in the end of the day, I'm a far better doctor with my money than I ever will be even through my clinical work. And that's an exciting thing to think about no matter what job you're in, because that can be true for almost any job that you have. So those are some ways I would say, to kind of navigate that.
That's great. We've had a question actually come in about BlessBig, which is the organization that you run. It's quite a specific one. Someone's been doing their research. What's your methodology in selecting your BlessBig recommended charities? Because it seems like some are more cost effective than Givewell ones, but some are much less.
Yes, they are. So the first strategy you have to use if you want to reach beyond the EA community is to give the general public something that they can value, but then to use that as a way to educate them. So you'll see lots of cause groups in our blessbig.org site that we would not put on there if it were purely an EA site. But we put them on there because people literally will not look at your website at all. This gets back to this is a foreign mindset to people if you don't have those cause groups on there. And those cause groups are important. It's not like those are not important. So what we have is a little caveat under those cause groups when you click on them that says, we really love that you're passionate about this cause, but have you considered using your time or advocacy or education to address these causes, and maybe using your money where it's going to have make a lot bigger of a difference? Now they can continue on and they can pick one of those charities, and those charities are decent charities. They're not great EA charities, but they're decent charities from a charity navigator standpoint. But what we want to do is value the fact that they have a passion and not shut that down while educating them towards something that's different. So that's why those charities are there, not because we really actually want them to give to them from an EA standpoint, but because we want them to know that they're valued and want to provide a platform that the general public will actually use. And they have. And that's actually worked really well to do that, because it's allowed them to enter into conversations with us that they wouldn't have spent 2 seconds looking at the website otherwise. So that's the first thing. As far as the methodology goes, we evaluate charities according to 4 parameters, as we say on the website. The first and most important, as we all know, is impact evidence. So is there retrospective, objective, high quality evidence to support the fact that this organization actually makes a measurable difference in their community? And of course, we would all like to have more of that. We would all love to have perfect research done on every organization, but we use what we have. And if any of you know of other evaluators that objectively and retrospectively evaluate charities, especially Christian ones, there's just a huge need for that. Please tell us, because we'd love to incorporate that. So that's our first tier, is that we use that as our top priority. The next priority is the one that people are a little more used to, which is the financial cost effectiveness or budget cost effectiveness and financial transparency. And so for those, we go to websites like, or we look at the Form 990s for those charities, or we'll go to websites like GuideStar or Charity Navigator or Charity Watch. There are several that look at the financial health and financial priorities of these charities. Of course, that's important, but it's not as important, because if you've got an organization like Against Malaria Foundation who's having thousands of times the impact per dollar as even the very best charity that's addressing homelessness, let's say, it doesn't matter if that charity is giving 100% of their budget to addressing homelessness. It's never going to be as impactful as an AMF, even if AMF was only giving 50% of their budget to their programs, right? So that's why impact evidence has to be at the top. But we do address that as a secondary characteristic. It also helps us with a tie-breaking type of a thing when it seems to have equal amounts of impact evidence, or when there seems to be equal holes or equal deficits in the quality of the impact evidence that we've evaluated for those charities. And then finally, we consider relative need, and this comes in two forms. We don't do as much with the room for more funding piece. That's one area of improvement I think we can add to our evaluation. But that takes time over years, obviously, to see where people are funding or not. But what we do relative need especially is to look for that cause where it's most neglected in the world. Organizations may have very good impact evidence and may have very good cost or budget effectiveness, but if they're working in the same place in the world as 10 other organizations, sometimes we find that that impact evidence is actually being shared by those organizations and that they're all claiming the same evidence for the same population. And so it looks great, and they say they're impacting a bunch of people, but you have to look and see if it's redundant. Are 10 organizations claiming the same recipients, the same service levels? And so we tend to focus on organizations that purposely go where nobody else is going, and purposely focus on needs that nobody else is focusing on. Again, getting away from that 95%. I'm happy to get more in detail about the meticulousness of how we actually get our ratings, but that's a very long answer, and I'm happy to talk with you about it. So email me if you want to know more about that, because I'd love to share more details. But that's the general methodology that we use.
Perfect. Well, we've got a couple of minutes over, Jay, so we're going to have to cut off there. But if anyone has any more questions to put in the Slido, please do drop them in there. That will remain open for a number of hours, and then we'll send the questions over to Jay to provide some written answers to that. And as he says, please do reach out if you want to have a chat, and particularly reach out if you know of any Christian charity evaluators that could help them. But thank you all very much for joining the session. We've got about 6 minutes before Paul Neal starts his main session, so you can either just take a breather or you can jump back into Gathertown, and look forward to seeing you all for the rest of the conference. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you all, and I look forward to following up with you. Please email me if you would like. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jay.